Have you ever wondered why some of the most successful people in history never finished college? What if everything you've been taught about success is actually designed to keep you dependent on a system that fears true independence? Most people believe that the world rewards skill, dedication, and hard work. We're told that if we follow the prescribed path, go to school, get good grades, earn a degree, find a job, success will inevitably follow. It's a comforting narrative, one that promises certainty in an uncertain world. But stay with me until the end, because this familiar story hides a disturbing truth that most will never recognize. The system doesn't actually hate the uneducated. What it truly fears are the self-educated, those rare individuals who dare to learn outside established channels. Has this ever happened to you? You've shared an unconventional idea or approach, only to be immediately questioned about your credentials or told that's not how it's done. There's a reason for that reaction, and it's not about protecting standards, it's about protecting power. Self-taught individuals represent an existential threat to institutional control. They can't be shaped by traditional pathways or influenced through conventional rewards. They operate beyond the predictable patterns that allow systems to maintain their grip on power. Think about it. From early childhood, we're conditioned to seek approval, to raise our hands before speaking, to memorize rather than question. The entire educational structure rewards compliance, not creativity or independent thinking. But before we begin digging deeper into this hidden reality, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. What you're about to discover might surprise you. The mechanisms of control are far more subtle than most realize. They don't operate through direct force, but through carefully constructed belief systems. Neville Goddard understood this principle when he observed that controlling people's beliefs is far more effective than controlling their bodies. When you believe you need permission to succeed, you've already surrendered your power. Look around at the innovators who've transformed our world. From Edison to Einstein, from Jobs to Musk, and you'll notice a pattern. The system initially rejected them, labeled them as misfits or troublemakers, then later claimed them as products of institutional success. This revision of history serves a purpose: to maintain the illusion that meaningful achievement requires institutional approval. The uncomfortable truth is that institutions aren't designed to cultivate independent thinkers. They're engineered to produce reliable, predictable participants. They provide tools, but carefully restrict how those tools can be applied. They celebrate creativity, but only within tightly defined boundaries. And they respond to genuine innovation with skepticism or outright hostility until that innovation proves too valuable to ignore. As we continue our exploration of this hidden dynamic, ask yourself this question. If the system truly wanted everyone to succeed through independent thought, why does it consistently undermine those who learn outside approved channels? The answer reveals a fundamental conflict that shapes our entire society. The system's approach to shaping minds begins far earlier than most people realize. Think back to your earlier school experiences. What behaviors were rewarded? Sitting quietly, following instructions precisely, raising your hand before speaking. From our first day in a classroom, we're not being taught how to think. We're being taught how to obey. This mindset transformation happens so gradually that we rarely notice it. The child who questions why too often is labeled disruptive. The student who proposes alternative solutions is told to just follow the instructions. The educational journey becomes less about discovery and more about demonstrating compliance through memorization and regurgitation. If these ideas resonated with you, hit subscribe to join our community of independent thinkers who are breaking free from conventional systems. I dive deep into topics most channels won't touch. Behind the scenes of this conditioning lies a profound revelation. Systems of power don't want independent thinkers, they want predictable participants. The hidden truth is that our educational institutions weren't designed to maximize human potential. They were engineered to produce consistent, manageable outputs. The industrial model of education was never about unleashing creativity. It was about creating workers who would follow instructions without questioning authority. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining why independence represents such a fundamental threat to established power structures. The self-taught individual operates outside the traditional framework of validation and permission. They don't wait for credentials to create value. They don't seek approval before implementing ideas. They build, test, fail, adjust, and succeed through direct engagement with reality rather than through institutional intermediaries. This direct relationship with creation, whether it's building a business, developing technology, or producing art, bypasses the gatekeepers who traditionally control access to opportunity. When you can learn independently, apply knowledge directly, and build without permission, you've effectively removed the leverage points that systems use to maintain control. Consider the impact this has on traditional power dynamics. Institutions maintain their authority through the ability to grant or withhold opportunities, degrees, certifications, licenses. These are the modern equivalents of royal warrants, allowing certain individuals to practice trades while excluding others. But the self-taught person who proves their value through results rather than credentials undermines this entire structure. The decisions you make about how you learn and validate your abilities aren't just personal choices. They're political acts that either reinforce or challenge existing power structures. Each time someone chooses self-education over institutional approval, they're voting for a different kind of world, one where results matter more than pedigrees, where innovation isn't confined to approved channels, and where individual agency takes precedence over institutional control. This is precisely why the truly self-taught are often marginalized, mocked, or dismissed until their success becomes too significant to ignore. The system's reaction isn't personal, it's structural. Independent learning and application represent an existential threat to the very foundations of institutional authority. If you've ever felt this resistance to your own self-directed path, write "Freedom frightens them" in the comments below. Let's expose the uncomfortable paradox at the heart of our educational and professional systems. While they claim to value intelligence, creativity, and innovation, their actual reward structures tell a different story. Look closely at who receives promotions, opportunities, and institutional support. It's rarely the most creative thinker or the most innovative problem solver. It's almost always the reliable executor, the person who consistently delivers predictable results without disrupting established processes. This revelation becomes clear when you observe the blueprint for success that's promoted from childhood. Excel in standardized education, obtain recognized credentials, secure a position within an established organization, advance through approved channels, and eventually retire with institutional approval. This journey isn't designed to maximize human potential. It's engineered to create predictable social and economic outcomes. The mindset behind this system isn't difficult to understand. Predictability equals stability, and stability benefits those already in positions of influence. The true threat of the questioner, the innovator, or the self-directed learner isn't that they might fail, it's that they might succeed through pathways that can't be controlled or replicated by institutional authorities. What's particularly insidious about this architecture of control is the language of freedom it employs. The system masterfully presents itself as the path to liberation through education and opportunity. Get educated to be free, they say. Learn these skills to control your destiny. Yet behind the scenes, a careful curation occurs, not of whether you learn, but of what you learn and how you apply that knowledge. The transformation that institutional education provides isn't primarily intellectual, it's psychological. You're given tools, but within frameworks that direct how those tools can be used. You're taught to solve problems, but within boundaries that serve existing power structures. The illusion of choice is maintained through a diversity of options that all lead to essentially similar outcomes. Productive participation within established systems. This isn't to suggest some dark conspiracy with malevolent actors plotting control. Rather, it's the natural evolution of systems designed to perpetuate themselves. Organizations, institutions, and power structures naturally develop mechanisms that ensure their continued relevance and authority. The journey toward institutional self-preservation inevitably leads to the suppression of truly disruptive thinking. When you begin viewing educational and professional pathways through this lens, countless seemingly disconnected observations suddenly align into a coherent pattern. Why do schools prioritize standardized testing over creative problem solving? Why do credentials often matter more than demonstrated competence? Why are unconventional thinkers frequently marginalized until their success becomes too significant to ignore? The system's fragility is exposed precisely when individuals succeed outside its prescribed pathways. Each self-taught success story reveals that the institutional gatekeepers may not be necessary after all, that the emperor of credentialism might have fewer clothes than we've been led to believe. If you've recognized these patterns in your own experience with education or work, type "eyes wide open" in the comments. The pattern becomes even more evident when we examine history's greatest innovators and their relationships with established institutions. Einstein struggled to find academic employment and developed his theory of relativity while working as a patent clerk. Steve Jobs was a college dropout who was later forced out of his own company before returning to revolutionize multiple industries. Tesla died in obscurity despite his world-changing contributions to electrical engineering. What's fascinating about these journeys isn't just that these individuals succeeded outside conventional frameworks, it's how the system subsequently absorbed and reframed their stories. The revolutionary becomes the establishment hero. The outsider becomes retroactively claimed as a product of the very system that initially rejected them. This revision of history serves a critical purpose: to maintain the narrative that extraordinary success still requires institutional blessing. Behind the scenes of these sanitized success stories lies a consistent pattern of resistance to emerging independent thinkers. The same institutions that celebrate yesterday's innovators actively resist today's. This isn't hypocrisy. It's a fundamental aspect of how systems preserve themselves while adapting to inevitable change. They resist until resistance becomes futile, then they absorb and claim ownership. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining perhaps the most powerful mechanism of control: manufactured dependence. The masterful achievement of institutional education isn't just teaching specific content. It's creating a profound psychological dependency on external validation. From our earliest school experiences, we're trained to seek approval through grades, recognition, and credentials. This dependency reshapes our relationship with learning itself. The question transforms from "what do I want to understand" to "what will be on the test?" The intrinsic human drive toward mastery becomes subordinated to the extrinsic pursuit of institutional markers of success. The mindset shift is subtle but profound. Knowledge becomes valuable not for its application, but for the status it confers. The revelation that many miss is how this dependency extends far beyond formal education. It creates individuals who cannot conceive of success outside approved channels. Where did you go to school? Becomes the first question in interviews. What are your qualifications? Becomes the reflexive challenge to new ideas. The system convinces us that our value exists in our credentials rather than our capabilities. This manufactured dependence is the perfect control mechanism because it operates through internal constraints rather than external ones. People become their own gatekeepers, limiting their aspirations to paths with institutional approval. The true impact isn't just economic, it's a fundamental reshaping of human potential and self-conception. The most powerful prison isn't one with visible bars, but one where the captives believe the walls are there for their protection, where they've internalized the idea that safety lies in compliance and danger in independence. Breaking free requires not just acquiring knowledge outside approved channels, but recognizing that the approval itself was never necessary. If you've felt this invisible pressure to seek validation through conventional credentials, write "breaking free" in the comments. Neville Goddard, in his profound understanding of human consciousness and social control, recognized something that most institutional thinkers deliberately ignore. He observed that true power doesn't come from memorizing approved information. It emerges when knowledge is independently discovered, internalized, and applied. This revelation transforms our understanding of education and power dynamics in society. Subscribe now to access more content that challenges mainstream narratives and reveals the hidden dynamics of power and control. This channel exists for those ready to think differently. The most effective form of control has never been through obvious force or direct coercion. Those methods create resistance and ultimately fail. The masterful approach, the one that Goddard identified, operates through carefully constructed belief systems that create an illusion of freedom while maintaining predictable patterns of behavior. When people believe they're making independent choices while actually moving along pre-designed pathways, the perfect control mechanism has been achieved. This insight reveals the subtle architecture behind what we experience as free choice in modern society. Consider the typical journey of a young person making educational and career decisions. They appear to have countless options, different schools, various majors, diverse career paths. Yet these seemingly unlimited choices operate within carefully defined boundaries that consistently produce similar outcomes. Productive participants who reinforce existing systems rather than challenge them. The transformation happens through a subtle filtering process that operates not through prohibition, but through incentive structures. Certain paths are made easier, more accessible, more socially rewarded. Others are technically available but practically difficult, requiring more resources, offering less stability, attracting social disapproval. The revelation isn't that choice doesn't exist. It's that the menu of options has been carefully curated to maintain predictable outcomes. Behind the scenes of our decisions lies an invisible framework of rewards and punishments that shapes our trajectory without our conscious awareness. The system doesn't need to explicitly forbid independent thinking or self-directed learning. It simply needs to ensure that following prescribed paths feels safer, more rational, and more socially validated than forging your own. This mindset cultivation begins early, with parents naturally encouraging practical education that leads to stable careers. It continues through educational institutions that claim to value critical thinking while rewarding conformity. And it extends into professional environments that talk about innovation while systematically marginalizing truly disruptive thinkers. The journey appears self-directed while actually moving along channels designed for predictable outcomes. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining how this illusion of choice manifests in our daily decision-making. The system doesn't just shape major life decisions, it influences how we think about success, value, and even personal identity. The most powerful constraints aren't external barriers, but internalized limitations that we've absorbed without questioning. The true impact of this pre-filtering extends beyond career trajectories. It shapes our concepts of what's possible, reasonable, or worth pursuing. It defines the boundaries of acceptable discourse and legitimate questioning. Most critically, it creates a profound psychological barrier to recognizing the very constraints that shape our thinking. The perfect prison is one where the inmates believe themselves to be free, where the walls exist not in physical space but in the architecture of belief. If you've started noticing these hidden frameworks influencing your own choices, type "Seeing the Matrix" in the comments. One of the most fascinating revelations about institutional power is how it maintains its narrative control even when faced with clear contradictions. Watch carefully what happens when someone succeeds dramatically outside the approved channels. First comes dismissal. They're labeled as lucky, unusual, or a mere exception. If their success persists, the response transforms to criticism. They're portrayed as dangerous, reckless, or unethical. But here's where the true manipulation occurs. Once their success becomes undeniable, the system smoothly shifts to claiming them as its own product. This pattern of ignore, attack, then claim works like a brilliant magic trick. It allows the institution to maintain the illusion that meaningful success still requires institutional blessing, even when faced with clear evidence to the contrary. The transformation happens so gradually that most people never notice the contradiction. The outsider rebel becomes reframed as the visionary who was supported by forward-thinking institutions all along. The most powerful example of this rewriting occurs in how we teach history. Thomas Edison is portrayed as a product of American innovation systems rather than a self-taught inventor who created his own research methodology. Einstein becomes the iconic academic physicist rather than someone whose breakthrough work happened outside academia. The narrative sanitizes the messy reality that these individuals often succeeded despite institutional resistance, not because of institutional support. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining why self-taught individuals represent more than just individual anomalies. They embody the potential for systemic disruption. The true impact of independent learning extends far beyond personal success. When someone learns outside established channels and applies that knowledge effectively, they're not just succeeding individually, they're demonstrating that alternative pathways exist. This revelation represents an existential threat to institutional control, precisely because it creates the possibility of new systems entirely. Each self-educated person who builds something valuable outside approved channels demonstrates that the gatekeepers may not be necessary. Each independent success creates a template that others can follow, potentially triggering a cascade effect that challenges fundamental power structures. Behind the scenes of institutional resistance to self-education lies this deeper fear, not just of individual outliers, but of alternative systems that might render existing hierarchies obsolete. The journey from controlled education to independent learning isn't just a personal transformation. It's potentially the beginning of structural change that established powers cannot control. Consider the mindset shift that occurs when someone recognizes they can learn anything they want, directly from primary sources, expert practitioners, or through experimentation. This discovery doesn't just expand their personal options, it fundamentally changes their relationship with authority and institutional validation. They become carriers of a dangerous idea, that the middlemen of knowledge might be unnecessary. This explains why institutional responses to self-taught success are so vigorous and often seem disproportionate. The real threat isn't the individual success story, it's the demonstration effect that might inspire others to step outside controlled pathways. Each visible example of independent achievement doesn't just represent one person's journey. It creates a proof of concept that could potentially scale beyond institutional control. If you've recognized this pattern of institutions claiming self-taught success stories after the fact, write narrative hijacking in the comments. We're living through perhaps the most significant disruption to knowledge control in human history. The internet has fundamentally shattered the monopoly that traditional institutions once held over information. For centuries, knowledge was contained within physical spaces, universities, libraries, guilds, that could control access through admissions processes, geographical limitations, and financial barriers. That world has disappeared almost overnight. Today, anyone with an internet connection can access information that would have previously required institutional membership, geographical proximity to centers of learning, or significant financial resources. This democratization of knowledge represents a profound shift in power dynamics, one that established institutions are struggling to address effectively. The transformation isn't just about access to information. It's about the collapse of institutional gatekeeping entirely. When someone can learn directly from world-class practitioners through online courses, videos, or communities, the traditional certification pathway loses its exclusive claim to legitimacy. The journey of discovery no longer requires institutional permission or guidance. Behind the scenes, this shift has triggered a predictable institutional response. Rather than adapting to the new reality of democratized knowledge, the system has doubled down on questioning the credibility of self-acquired learning. But is it accredited? Becomes the reflexive challenge. How do you verify quality without institutional oversight becomes the persistent concern. These responses aren't about protecting standards. They're about protecting control. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining the fundamental disconnect between how success is measured in institutional settings versus real-world applications. This revelation exposes perhaps the most significant misalignment in our educational model: the gap between credentials and competence. The mindset of traditional education prioritizes theoretical knowledge that can be easily assessed through standardized testing. But the impact of this approach is a generation of graduates who often struggle to apply their learning in practical contexts. Meanwhile, those who learn through direct application, building, failing, adapting, and rebuilding, develop a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge. This creates a paradoxical situation where the most highly credentialed individuals aren't necessarily the most capable. The system continues to promote credentials as the primary marker of ability, yet practical experience consistently produces superior results in real-world applications. The self-taught pathway inherently prioritizes application over theory, adaptability over standardization, and results over approval. Consider the journey of someone learning through direct experience versus institutional education. The self-taught individual must demonstrate competence immediately. Their work either functions or it doesn't. There's no curve grading, no partial credit for understanding the concept without execution. This creates a ruthlessly effective feedback loop that builds genuine capability rather than the appearance of knowledge. The revelation here isn't just about individual learning preferences. It's about fundamentally different approaches to validating knowledge. The institutional path validates through proxies, tests, papers, credentials. The self-taught path validates through direct results. Does it work? Does it solve the problem? Does it create value? This distinction creates dramatically different outcomes despite addressing the same apparent goal of education. If you've noticed this gap between credentials and real-world competence in your field, write "results over resumes" in the comments. Have you ever noticed the uncomfortable reaction that often emerges when a self-taught person achieves significant success in a field dominated by credentials? It's not just jealousy or confusion, it's a profound cognitive dissonance that arises when reality contradicts deeply held beliefs about how success should be achieved. This discomfort reveals something profound about our collective relationship with institutional approval. When someone succeeds without following the prescribed path, it creates an existential crisis for those who've invested heavily in that path. The uncomfortable question emerges: if they could achieve this without the years of formal education, the student loans, the institutional validation, what was my investment actually for? This revelation threatens not just professional identity, but often entire worldviews built around institutional legitimacy. The transformation this creates isn't just individual. It ripples through entire communities and industries. Each visible example of self-taught success creates permission for others to question the necessity of traditional pathways. Each demonstration that results can be achieved without institutional blessing weakens the psychological hold that credentialism maintains over collective imagination. Behind the scenes of this disruption, however, another process unfolds. The system isn't static, it's adaptive. When an independent approach demonstrates consistent success outside institutional boundaries, the system doesn't just fight it, it studies it, learns from it, and ultimately attempts to absorb it. This cycle of resistance, followed by incorporation, represents one of the most fascinating aspects of how power structures maintain themselves across time. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining how this absorption strategy plays out in real time. Consider how online learning began as a radical democratization of knowledge outside traditional universities. Early platforms offered free courses taught by leading experts without admissions requirements or credentials. This represented a genuine threat to institutional control of educational pathways. The mindset shift that these platforms initially promised was revolutionary. Learning would be separated from credentialing, knowledge would flow freely, and results would matter more than pedigree. But watch carefully what happened next. As these platforms demonstrated success, traditional institutions moved to incorporate them. Universities launched their own online programs. Certification pathways were established. What began as rebellion became gradually institutionalized. The journey from outsider innovation to institutional absorption follows a predictable pattern. First comes dismissal. It's not serious learning. Then competition. Our online program is more rigorous. Finally, incorporation. We now offer certificates in these emerging fields. The impact of this pattern is that revolutionary approaches are gradually domesticated, their most disruptive elements softened or eliminated as they're brought within institutional frameworks. This pattern extends far beyond education into every domain where independent pathways threaten established control. Freelancing, content creation, direct-to-consumer business models all began as rebellious alternatives to institutional gatekeeping, and all have experienced varying degrees of institutional absorption. The system doesn't just resist change, it studies what it cannot defeat and incorporates elements that serve its purposes. If you've witnessed innovative approaches gradually being co-opted by the very institutions they once challenged, write "absorption tactic" in the comments. This absorption strategy reveals a deeper truth about how power maintains itself across time. When the system encounters something truly disruptive that cannot be easily controlled, it shifts to a more sophisticated approach: ownership rather than destruction. This pattern represents one of the most subtle and effective control mechanisms in modern society, the assimilation of the rebel. Watch what happens when a self-taught individual achieves undeniable success outside institutional channels. Suddenly, the system that once mocked or dismissed them extends invitations, speaking engagements, advisory positions, honorary degrees, partnership opportunities. What appears as recognition is often a sophisticated attempt at neutralization through incorporation. The rebel is offered comfort, status, and validation precisely when they've proven they don't need it. The transformation that occurs through this process is profound and often imperceptible to the person experiencing it. The sharp edges of disruption are gradually softened. The revolutionary perspective becomes more nuanced, which often means less threatening. The outsider begins to identify with the very institutions they once challenged. This journey from rebellion to assimilation happens so subtly that most never recognize the shift in their own. You're thinking, behind the scenes of these individual stories lies a broader pattern of systemic self-preservation. The institution doesn't need to destroy what threatens it if it can convert the threat into an asset. By bringing the successful outsider within its boundaries, it simultaneously neutralizes the threat and strengthens its claim to represent all legitimate paths to success. The narrative becomes, see, even the rebels eventually come to us, rather than acknowledging that the rebel succeeded despite institutional resistance. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining what true freedom actually looks like in this context. The revelation that most miss is that genuine autonomy doesn't come from achieving success that the system finally recognizes. It comes from becoming psychologically independent, from needing that recognition at all. The mindset shift required for this independence is profound. It means valuing your own assessment of your work above external validation. It means finding fulfillment in the process of creation and the evidence of results rather than in credentials or institutional approval. Most challenging of all, it means being willing to stand alone when necessary, to follow your own judgment even when conventional wisdom points elsewhere. This journey toward independence isn't just professionally challenging, it's emotionally demanding. Humans are social creatures who naturally seek belonging and validation. The path of the self-taught involves periods of isolation, doubt, and being misunderstood. Yet this difficult path develops a type of resilience and internal compass that institutional pathways simply cannot provide. The impact of achieving this independence extends far beyond professional outcomes. It creates a fundamentally different relationship with authority, with failure, and with your own capabilities. When you've proven to yourself that you can learn, adapt, and create value without external validation, you develop an unshakable core that no market shift, credential inflation, or technological disruption can threaten. If you felt the pull between pursuing true independence and accepting the comfort of institutional belonging, write "independent mind" in the comments. One of the most liberating revelations in this entire exploration is recognizing that the system isn't malfunctioning. It's operating precisely as designed. When we observe educational institutions that seem to prioritize compliance over creativity, credentials over competence, and memorization over meaningful application, we're not seeing failures of implementation. We're witnessing the successful execution of systems designed to produce predictable, manageable outputs. This insight fundamentally changes how we approach the challenge. Many well-intentioned reformers attempt to fix educational systems by working within their existing frameworks, adjusting curricula, modifying testing, or updating pedagogical approaches. But these efforts consistently fall short because they misdiagnose the situation. The blueprint itself isn't broken. It's purposefully engineered to create certain outcomes, primarily compliant participants rather than independent thinkers. The transformation this understanding creates is profound. Rather than trying to win a game with rules designed for your containment, you recognize the need to step outside the game entirely. The journey shifts from, "How do I succeed within these constraints?" to, "How do I build something valuable outside these artificial boundaries?" This perspective shift doesn't just change strategies, it reimagines what success actually means. Behind the scenes of every true innovation, every paradigm shift, every revolutionary advance, lies this fundamental decision to operate outside established frameworks rather than trying to excel within them. The most significant breakthroughs rarely come from those who play by existing rules more effectively. They emerge from those who recognize when rules have become constraints and choose to operate beyond them. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining the specific resources that give self-taught individuals their unique advantage. The revelation that most miss is that the most powerful assets in the modern world aren't tangible resources that can be controlled through traditional means. They're intangible qualities that institutions struggle to regulate or contain. The mindset of the self-taught person centers on mastering these intangibles: time, focus, and creativity. While institutions can control access to buildings, credentials, and formal opportunities, they cannot directly regulate how individuals manage these internal resources. This creates a strategic advantage for those who learn to deploy these assets effectively outside institutional constraints. Consider the impact of mastering these intangibles. When you control your time rather than surrendering it to institutional schedules, you can align your peak cognitive hours with your most important work. When you cultivate focused attention in a distraction-driven world, you can accomplish in hours what others require days to complete. When you nurture creativity outside approved channels, you can envision solutions that institutionalized thinking cannot conceive. These capabilities become particularly powerful when deployed within the growing spaces where credentials matter less than demonstrable results: entrepreneurship, content creation, technical innovation, and independent research. In these domains, the self-taught individual's ability to manage intangible resources translates directly into tangible outcomes that can't be ignored even by credential-focused systems. If you've recognized that mastering your own time, focus, and creativity has become your greatest advantage, write "internal resources" in the comments. This perspective shift reveals perhaps the most powerful insight of all. The ultimate goal isn't to fight against existing systems, but to transcend them entirely. Fighting institutional constraints still keeps you trapped in their frame of reference, still acknowledges their relevance and power over your journey. The true transformation comes when you evolve beyond needing what they offer, not through rejection, but through genuine transcendence. Consider the mindset difference between someone fighting for recognition within a system versus someone who has outgrown the need for that recognition entirely. The first remains emotionally tethered to institutional validation, even if that tether is negative. Their identity and sense of purpose remain defined by opposition to something. The second has achieved a fundamentally different relationship with institutional power. They neither oppose nor conform. They simply create according to their own vision. This journey toward transcendence represents the most profound form of personal sovereignty, when you no longer need institutional blessing to validate your work, your thinking, or your identity. You've achieved a type of freedom that few ever experience. You can engage with institutions when useful, ignore them when irrelevant, and create alternatives when necessary, all without the emotional charge that comes from seeking approval or fighting rejection. Behind the scenes of this transcendence lies the revelation of why established systems respond to self-taught. individuals with such disproportionate hostility? The unspoken truth is that these reactions stem not from concern about quality or standards, but from profound fear. Self-taught individuals represent unpredictable variables in systems engineered for predictability. They demonstrate paths to success that cannot be easily monitored, regulated, or controlled. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining what makes independent thinkers so threatening to established power structures. The true impact of self-education isn't just the knowledge gained, it's the psychological liberation from needing permission to learn, apply, and create. This independence creates individuals who make decisions based on direct engagement with reality rather than through the filter of institutional approval. This direct relationship with learning and creation produces individuals who respond to opportunity and challenge in ways that institutional thinking cannot predict or easily counter. They adapt more quickly, pivot more freely, and experiment more boldly because they haven't internalized the boundaries that institutional education carefully instills. Their decision-making process operates from fundamentally different assumptions about what's possible, permissible, and valuable. When enough people begin operating from this place of independence, systems built on predictable compliance face an existential challenge. One self-taught success can be dismissed as an anomaly, but many such successes reveal structural weaknesses in the institutional model itself. Each person who achieves meaningful results outside approved channels undermines the central narrative that institutional validation is necessary for legitimate success. The revelation here isn't just about individual liberation, but about collective transformation. As more people recognize that they can learn, create, and succeed independently, the monopoly on opportunity that institutions have maintained begins to crumble. New networks, communities, and systems emerge that operate according to different principles. Merit demonstrated through results rather than credentials, innovation valued over compliance, adaptation prioritized over standardization. If you've found yourself moving beyond fighting the system to creating something better outside of it, write "Beyond the Game" in the comments. To truly understand why self-taught individuals trigger such strong institutional resistance, we need to examine the fundamental operating principle of all large systems: predictability. Every major institution, educational, governmental, corporate, depends on being able to forecast behavior with reasonable accuracy. They need to know how people will respond to incentives, what they'll consume, how they'll vote, when they'll spend, and how much debt they'll tolerate. This predictability isn't just convenient. It's existentially necessary for institutional stability. The self-taught individual represents a fundamental disruption to this predictive model. When someone steps outside established pathways, their decisions no longer follow the expected patterns that institutions rely upon. They don't respond to the same incentives, they aren't motivated by the same rewards, and they don't fear the same consequences. This unpredictability makes them impossible to model effectively within institutional frameworks designed for compliance and control. The transformation that occurs when someone breaks free from predictable patterns extends far beyond their individual choices. Each visible example of successful deviation creates permission for others to explore similar independence. The ripple effect of even a single individual operating outside expected parameters can trigger cascading unpredictability that institutions struggle to contain or counter effectively. Behind the scenes of institutional resistance to self-education lies this profound threat to predictive stability. It's not just about maintaining control over specific individuals. It's about preserving the broader patterns that make systems manageable. When enough people begin operating independently, the entire predictive model breaks down, creating fundamental challenges to institutional authority and effectiveness. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining Neville Goddard's profound insight about the revolutionary nature of new thinking. Goddard observed that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in introducing a new order of things. This revelation captures precisely why self-taught individuals face such significant resistance. The mindset shift required for self-education doesn't just change what you know, it transforms how you think. It creates a fundamentally different relationship with authority, with possibility, and with your own capacity for independent judgment. This new order of thinking represents exactly the kind of paradigm shift that Goddard recognized as simultaneously most valuable and most threatening to established power. Consider the journey of someone who begins questioning not just specific knowledge, but the entire framework through which knowledge is validated. They start asking not just what should I learn, but who determines what's worth knowing. Not just how do I succeed within this system, but who designed this system and for what purpose. These questions don't just seek information, they challenge the fundamental authority of those who have positioned themselves as arbiters of legitimate knowledge. This independent questioning represents precisely the kind of new order that established systems resist most vigorously. It's not just challenging specific rules, it's questioning the authority to make rules at all. It's not just seeking alternative paths to success, it's redefining what success actually means. This level of fundamental reimagining creates exactly the kind of uncertainty that Goddard identified as most disruptive to established orders. If you felt the resistance that comes when you start questioning fundamental assumptions rather than just specific rules, write "New Order Thinking" in the comments. When we examine educational institutions closely, a revealing pattern emerges that few recognize until it's pointed out. These systems don't actually measure intelligence or creativity, they measure compliance. Consider the behaviors that consistently receive the highest rewards in traditional education. Is it the student who questions underlying assumptions? The one who proposes alternative approaches? The one who challenges the teacher's perspective? Rarely. The students who receive the highest marks, the most recognition, and the smoothest advancement are invariably those who most accurately repeat what they've been told. This revelation transforms our understanding of what traditional education actually selects. 4. The straight-A student isn't necessarily the most intelligent, they're often the most compliant. Raise your hand before speaking. Follow instructions precisely. Memorize approved content. Reproduce it accurately. Don't challenge fundamental assumptions. This pattern of reward and punishment creates powerful psychological conditioning that extends far beyond formal education into how we approach authority throughout life. The paradigm shift occurs when you recognize that this measurement isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Educational institutions aren't failing to measure intelligence, they're succeeding at measuring and reinforcing compliance. This isn't cynical interpretation, but rather a clear-eyed assessment of the actual behaviors that receive consistent reward versus those that trigger punishment or marginalization. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining what happens when someone steps outside these carefully measured pathways entirely. The journey of self-education resembles exploration of unmapped territory. It's challenging, sometimes disorienting, and often lonely, but it leads to discoveries that would be impossible through prescribed routes. Consider the fundamental difference in the learning experience. The institutional path provides clear markers, defined milestones, and consistent feedback, but only within predetermined boundaries. The self-directed path lacks these comfortable guideposts. You'll get lost. You'll follow dead ends. You'll question your direction. This uncertainty creates a powerful filtration mechanism. Many start the journey, but few persist through the inevitable challenges. Yet this very difficulty creates the opportunity for discovery that prescribed paths cannot offer. When you venture beyond mapped territories, you encounter ideas, approaches, and connections that institutional thinking cannot accommodate. The awakening that occurs through this exploration isn't just intellectual. It's a profound liberation from dependency on external validation and guidance. Behind the scenes of every significant breakthrough lies this willingness to venture into uncertainty. The greatest discoveries don't happen along well-traveled roads. They emerge when someone dares to step off the path entirely, risking discomfort and failure to explore what might be possible beyond institutional boundaries. This exploration creates a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge, not as something to be received, but as territory to be discovered through direct experience. The potential revealed through this journey extends far beyond specific knowledge gained. The self-taught explorer develops navigational capabilities that institutional learning rarely cultivates. The ability to orient without external guidance, to assess value without institutional validation, to persist through confusion toward clarity. These meta-skills create a type of intellectual and psychological independence that represents the true treasure of self-education. If you've experienced both the challenge and the liberation of learning outside predefined pathways, write "Explorer Mindset" in the comments. One of the most unexpected challenges on the self-taught journey isn't intellectual, it's social. When you begin learning independently, pursuing knowledge outside approved channels, you'll likely encounter a striking pattern of resistance from friends, family, and colleagues. Who do you think you are? Why not just get a proper degree? That's not how things are done. This reaction often feels personal, but understanding its true source reveals something profound about human psychology and social dynamics. This resistance rarely stems from genuine concern about your well-being or the quality of your learning. Rather, it emerges from the discomfort your choices create in those who have accepted institutional paths without question. Your decision to step outside established frameworks forces an uncomfortable mirror onto the compromises and limitations others have accepted. Your independence becomes a silent challenge to their compliance. The transformation that occurs when you understand this dynamic is liberating. You recognize that the mockery, concern, or dismissal isn't actually about you. It's about the uncomfortable questions your choices raise for others. If this person can learn this skill without formal training, what does that say about my years of institutional investment? If they can succeed outside the system, does that mean my compliance was unnecessary? Your very existence as a self-directed learner creates cognitive dissonance that many find easier to resolve through dismissal than through questioning their own choices. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining perhaps the most crucial distinction between institutional and self-directed learning: the relationship between knowledge and application. The revelation that many miss is that information alone, no matter how comprehensive or accurate, provides virtually no power. The true advantage of self-education lies not in what you know, but in your ability to apply that knowledge effectively. This distinction has become increasingly critical in the digital age. Access to information is no longer a meaningful constraint for most people. Nearly anyone can find detailed explanations of almost any concept, skill, or domain of knowledge online. Yet despite this unprecedented access, Most people remain functionally constrained by institutional thinking patterns that separate knowledge from application. Behind the scenes of this paradox lies a profound mindset difference. Institutional education typically treats knowledge as something to be acquired and demonstrated through artificial assessments, tests, papers, presentations, rather than through direct application to real challenges. This creates a psychological barrier between knowing and doing that many never overcome. They learn concepts without developing the capacity to apply them in novel situations outside controlled environments. The self-taught journey naturally integrates knowledge and application because it typically begins with a specific challenge or objective rather than an abstract curriculum. You don't learn programming concepts because they're on a syllabus. You learn them because you need to build something specific. This direct connection between knowledge and purpose creates a fundamentally different relationship with learning, one focused on capability rather than credential. The awakening that occurs when you bridge this gap between knowledge and application transforms not just what you can do, but how you see yourself. You shift from being a passive recipient of information to an active creator of value. You move from asking, "What should I learn next?" to "What problem can I solve now?" This shift represents the true dividing line between those who merely consume information and those who transform it into meaningful impact. If you've experienced this shift from collecting information to focused application, write "knowledge into action" in the comments. For centuries, one of the most powerful forms of control has been the regulation of knowledge flow. Consider how information has historically been contained within physical spaces, universities, libraries, professional associations, with careful gatekeeping determining who gains access. This control over who learns what, when, and how represents one of the most fundamental mechanisms of power in any society. The ability to determine who receives certain information and who can obtain credentials essentially creates the ability to decide who succeeds. This revelation about knowledge flow control explains why institutional resistance to self-education runs so deep. When someone circumvents traditional gatekeeping mechanisms, learning directly from practitioners, accessing primary sources, or building skills through direct application, they're not just acquiring knowledge, they're bypassing one of the primary control mechanisms that established systems rely upon to maintain predictable outcomes and hierarchies. The transformation that occurs through this bypass extends far beyond individual learning. It represents a fundamental challenge to institutional authority over who can participate in which domains. When credentials can no longer effectively limit who practices certain skills or enters certain fields, a significant lever of social control begins to fail. Self-taught individuals become unpredictable variables in a system designed for controlled access and predetermined outcomes. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining how institutional control extends beyond knowledge itself into the realm of identity and self-worth. The most sophisticated form of control doesn't operate through restricting access to information, but through shaping how people define their value and identity. This represents a psychological dimension of institutional influence that many never consciously recognize. Consider how deeply our culture links self-worth to external markers. Degrees from prestigious institutions, professional titles, organizational affiliations, industry recognition. These status indicators aren't merely practical signals of competence. They become fundamental components of identity and self-conception. "I am a Harvard graduate," or "I'm a Goldman Sachs analyst," becomes not just a description of experience, but a core element of how people see themselves and their value in the world. The mindset shift this creates is profound and often invisible to those experiencing it. When your sense of worth becomes tied to institutional validation, you become vulnerable in ways that extend far beyond professional outcomes. The potential loss of status creates not just practical concerns, but existential ones. Who am I without these credentials? What is my value without this organizational affiliation? This vulnerability creates a powerful form of psychological dependence that can constrain behavior more effectively than any explicit rule. Behind the scenes of this status trap lies a revelation about how control operates most effectively, not through coercion, but through identity. When compliance becomes part of how you define yourself rather than something externally imposed, resistance becomes psychologically costly in ways that many find impossible to bear. The journey away from institutional validation doesn't just require developing new skills. It demands reconstructing your fundamental sense of who you are and where your value comes from. If you've felt the pull of defining your worth through credentials or titles rather than through what you can actually create or contribute, write "breaking the status chain" in the comments. The most profound liberation from institutional control comes through a fundamental shift in how you derive value and meaning. Self-taught individuals develop something remarkable, an internal value system based on creation rather than credentials. Rather than measuring worth through external markers of status, they build identity around what they can actually produce, solve, or contribute. This shift represents a complete inversion of the institutional model of validation. Consider how differently these approaches experience the world. When your sense of value comes primarily from credentials or affiliations, you remain perpetually vulnerable to external judgment and status anxiety. Your worth can be diminished through policy changes, market shifts, or institutional restructuring entirely outside your control. But when your value derives from your capacity to create, to solve problems, to generate meaningful outcomes that cannot be taken from you by any external authority, the transformation this creates isn't just professional, it's deeply psychological. You develop immunity to many of the control mechanisms that operate through status anxiety and fear of exclusion. Criticism matters less because your validation comes from results rather than approval. Institutional rejection loses its sting because your path doesn't depend on institutional blessing. This psychological resilience represents perhaps the most threatening aspect of self-education from the perspective of systems designed for compliance. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining another dimension that makes self-taught individuals particularly disruptive to established systems: their relationship with failure. The revelation here is that independent learners don't just tolerate failure, they transform through it, developing what philosopher Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility, the capacity to become stronger precisely because of stresses and challenges. This anti-fragile quality emerges naturally from the self-taught journey. When you learn through direct application rather than abstract assessment, failure becomes your most immediate and valuable teacher. Each unsuccessful attempt provides specific, actionable feedback that directly improves your next iteration. This creates a fundamentally different relationship with setbacks. They become essential components of growth rather than marks of inadequacy. Behind the scenes of this development lies a mindset that institutional education rarely cultivates. Traditional systems typically punish failure rather than leveraging it, creating risk aversion and fear of experimentation. The self-taught individual experiences the opposite conditioning. They learn that rapid failure, properly analyzed, leads to accelerated learning and unexpected discoveries. This embracing of failure as a pathway rather than an endpoint creates remarkable adaptability. The awakening this produces extends far beyond specific skills into a general approach to challenges. When you've learned Through repeated cycles of attempt, failure, analysis, and improvement, you develop confidence in your ability to navigate uncertainty. You recognize that initial failure rarely represents final outcomes. It's simply information guiding your next approach. This resilience makes self-taught individuals particularly threatening to systems that expect predictable responses to pressure. Consider the strategic implications of this anti-fragility. Institutional attempts to discourage or discredit self-taught pathways often backfire, actually strengthening the resolve and adaptability of independent learners. Criticism becomes data. Rejection becomes redirection. Opposition becomes opportunity. The very mechanisms designed to maintain control instead accelerate development beyond that control. This represents perhaps the ultimate irony of institutional resistance to self-education. If you found yourself growing stronger through experiences that were meant to discourage you, write anti-fragile in the comments. When we examine history's most transformative figures across domains, science, art, business, philosophy, a striking pattern emerges that conventional narratives often obscure. The individuals who created paradigm shifts, who fundamentally reimagined what was possible, were predominantly self-taught in their areas of greatest contribution. This isn't to suggest they never engaged with formal education. Many did. But their breakthroughs came specifically in domains where they operated outside institutional frameworks. Consider Einstein developing relativity while working as a patent clerk, not as a university physicist. Examine how Leonardo da Vinci pursued his comprehensive studies of anatomy, engineering, and art without formal academic training. Look at how Elon Musk taught himself rocket science through reading and direct questioning of experts, rather than through aerospace engineering programs. The pattern repeats across centuries and disciplines. The revelation here isn't that these individuals rejected learning, quite the opposite. They pursued knowledge with extraordinary intensity and discipline. What they rejected was institutionally constrained learning. The artificial boundaries, the predetermined methods, the accepted limitations that institutional education inevitably imposes. Their independence from these constraints enabled them to explore possibilities that conventional thinking couldn't accommodate. The transformation that self-directed learning made possible for these figures wasn't just about specific knowledge acquired. It was about developing fundamentally different thinking patterns, the ability to question assumptions that others accepted without examination, to combine insights from disparate fields in ways that specialized education discourages, to persist through failures that would have resulted in institutional rejection. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining the uncomfortable truth about what institutional education actually optimizes for. Behind the rhetoric about developing potential and cultivating intelligence lies a much simpler objective: creating obedience. The system's concern with what you learn masks its deeper interest in how you relate to authority and established frameworks. This isn't a cynical interpretation, but rather a clear-eyed assessment of what educational institutions actually measure and reward. Consider what behaviors consistently receive positive reinforcement, following instructions precisely, accepting established premises without question, producing work that meets predetermined expectations. Conversely, observe what triggers negative consequences, challenging fundamental assumptions, pursuing unauthorized lines of inquiry, questioning the authority of those delivering information. The awakening that occurs when you recognize this pattern transforms your entire relationship with institutional education. You begin to see that the discomfort you may have felt within these systems wasn't a reflection of your inadequacy, but rather a healthy resistance to psychological conditioning. Your impulse to question, To explore beyond boundaries, to challenge premises, wasn't a flaw to be corrected but a strength to be developed. The mindset shift this creates is profound. You recognize that educational institutions aren't primarily designed to maximize human potential. They're engineered to produce reliable participants in existing systems. Their fundamental concern isn't with what you might discover, but with whether you'll accept direction. This revelation doesn't necessarily make these institutions villainous, but it fundamentally changes how you engage with them, as tools to be used selectively rather than authorities to be obeyed unquestioningly. If you've ever felt that your questions or explorations were being subtly discouraged in educational settings, write "Truth Seeker" in the comments. Perhaps the most profound insight about institutional influence is how deeply it shapes not just what we know, but how we think. Most people aren't functioning as independent thinkers, but as programmed responders, operating from core beliefs about success, value, and purpose that were implanted through years of conditioning rather than conscious choice. This programming runs so deep that most never recognize it as external influence rather than personal conclusion. Consider how certain questions become unthinkable within this programming. Do I need a degree to succeed? Is traditional employment the only legitimate path? What if institutional approval doesn't determine my value? These possibilities often don't register as options because the programming defines them as unrealistic, irresponsible, or invalid before conscious consideration even occurs. The revelation that emerges through self-education isn't just acquiring specific knowledge, it's recognizing and breaking this deeper programming. When you begin learning outside approved channels, you inevitably encounter ideas that contradict institutional narratives. This creates cognitive dissonance that forces conscious examination of beliefs you previously accepted automatically. The journey shifts from passive absorption to active discernment. The transformation this creates extends far beyond specific domains of knowledge into your fundamental relationship with information and authority. You develop what might be called an epistemological immune system, the ability to evaluate claims based on evidence and reasoning rather than source credentialing. Information becomes something you actively assess rather than passively receive from approved authorities. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining how systems respond when someone begins breaking free from this programming. The awakening that comes through independent learning triggers predictable institutional responses that go beyond simple dismissal. The system actively works to recapture those who escape its boundaries, employing sophisticated methods of psychological influence. Behind the scenes of this recapture attempt lies a multi-layered strategy. First comes comfort, offers of recognition, inclusion, and legitimacy if you'll just bring your independent thinking back within approved frameworks. We value innovative thinking like yours. Why not join our program? Next comes doubt, subtle and not so subtle questioning of your capacity to succeed independently. Are you sure you can develop properly without expert guidance? Finally comes legitimacy questioning, challenges to your authority to operate outside approved channels. But how will people know your work is credible? This strategy is particularly effective because it targets fundamental human needs for belonging, certainty, and validation. The psychological pull to return to institutional approval can be powerful even for those who have experienced significant independent success. The system doesn't need to destroy what it cannot control if it can seduce it back into the fold through these deeply rooted psychological levers. The mindset shift required to resist this recapture attempt requires recognizing these strategies for what they are. Not genuine concern, but sophisticated methods of regaining control. When you understand that comfort offers often mask assimilation attempts, that doubt seeding targets natural uncertainty, and that legitimacy questioning relies on circular logic. Approved sources determine legitimacy. These approaches lose much of their psychological power. If you felt this pull to return to institutional approval, even after experiencing success through independent paths, write "resisting recapture" in the comments. Here's a truth rarely discussed on the self-taught journey. Most who begin this path don't fail because of intellectual limitations or skill deficits. They fail because of something much more fundamental: the profound psychological challenge of isolation. When you step outside institutional frameworks, you lose more than just structured guidance. You lose the social reinforcement and collective identity that these frameworks provide. The emotional reality of this independence is something few anticipate before experiencing it. There's a profound difference between intellectually deciding to pursue self-education and emotionally sustaining yourself through the inevitable periods of doubt, uncertainty, and isolation. Without the regular validation that institutional pathways provide, grades, advancement, peer recognition, you must generate your own sense of progress and purpose. This transformation demands a type of psychological resilience that conventional education rarely develops. In fact, traditional education often creates the opposite: dependency on external validation and structured feedback. When these supports disappear, many discover they've never developed the internal resources necessary to maintain motivation and confidence through extended periods of uncertainty. Behind the scenes of every successful self-taught journey lies this hidden battle, not primarily with the material being learned, but with the psychological challenges of standing alone, the capacity to trust your own judgment when everyone questions your path, to maintain confidence through inevitable failures, to find meaning in the work itself rather than external recognition. These represent the true tests of the independent learner. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining a critical insight that Neville Goddard would emphasize about self-education: the necessity of strategic thinking. The revelation here is that pure talent or determination isn't sufficient for success on unconventional paths. You must also be strategic about how you develop and reveal your capabilities in a world designed to resist independent challenges. Consider Goddard's wisdom about power dynamics. Those who understand how systems operate recognize that premature revelation of disruptive potential triggers defensive responses. The mindset shift this creates is profound. Rather than immediately challenging established frameworks, the wise, self-taught individual builds strength quietly, develops capability thoroughly, and reveals their full capacity only when sufficiently established to withstand inevitable resistance. This strategic approach transforms the journey from naive confrontation to sophisticated navigation. Rather than announcing intentions to disrupt or challenge before you've developed substantial capacity, you focus on building genuine value through consistent application. You perfect your skills in smaller, less threatening contexts. You accumulate evidence of effectiveness that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. You create allies and demonstrate value before attempting larger disruptions. The awakening this strategic mindset extends beyond individual success into understanding broader patterns of how change actually happens. Revolutionary ideas rarely succeed through frontal assault on established systems. They infiltrate gradually, demonstrate undeniable value in limited contexts, build evidence that cannot be easily dismissed, and create constituencies with vested interests in their success, all before directly challenging institutional frameworks. If you've recognized the importance of being strategic about when and how to reveal your self-taught capabilities, write "silent builder" in the comments. As systems of control have evolved, they've become increasingly sophisticated in their methods. The traditional approach of restricting access to information has largely collapsed in the digital age. Attempting to limit what people can learn is no longer viable when virtually all knowledge is accessible online. But rather than surrendering control, institutions have simply shifted to more effective strategies. Shame, noise, and constant distraction. This evolution reveals a profound insight about modern control mechanisms. They no longer operate primarily through restriction, but through overwhelm. Why ban information when you can simply drown it in an ocean of distraction? Why censor knowledge when you can bury it under endless entertainment? The system doesn't need to prevent you from learning. It simply needs to ensure you never focus long enough to transform information into meaningful application. The transformation is subtle but devastating. You think you're learning because you're consuming content, watching videos, reading articles, but you're caught in a cycle of passive consumption rather than active creation. You mistake information exposure for genuine development. You confuse content consumption with skill acquisition. This creates the perfect illusion, the feeling of progress without the reality of growth. Behind the scenes of this modern control mechanism lies a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Our neurological architecture wasn't designed for the constant stimulation of the digital age. Each notification, each new content piece, each social media update triggers dopamine responses that make distraction neurologically rewarding while making sustained focus increasingly difficult. The system has effectively weaponized our own biology against deep learning. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by examining what this environment demands from the modern self-taught individual. The revelation that most miss is that freedom without discipline doesn't lead to liberation. It leads to chaos. Without the external structure that institutions provide, the self-directed learner must develop exceptional self-regulation to succeed in an environment engineered for distraction. The mindset shift required is profound. You must recognize that the primary battlefield isn't external, but internal. The challenge isn't primarily finding information, but maintaining focus long enough to transform that information into capability. You must develop systems to protect your attention, manage your energy, and ensure consistent application over extended periods without external accountability structures. This discipline represents the critical dividing line between those who merely consume self-education content and those who actually transform through it. The journey requires developing personal frameworks that replace institutional structure, clear objectives that replace syllabi, consistent practice that replaces assignments, honest self-assessment that replaces grades, and community building that replaces institutional belonging. The awakening comes in recognizing that freedom and discipline aren't opposing forces, but essential complements. True independence doesn't mean freedom from structure. It means consciously choosing structures that serve your development rather than having them imposed. Externally, the self-taught path doesn't eliminate necessary constraints. It transfers the responsibility for creating and maintaining those constraints from institutions to the individual. If you've recognized that your greatest challenge isn't finding information, but maintaining the discipline to transform it into capability, write "disciplined freedom" in the comments. If you've made it this far with me, you've already demonstrated something remarkable: the capacity to engage deeply with ideas that challenge conventional thinking. That's increasingly rare in a world designed for distraction. What we've explored together isn't just theoretical. It's a framework for understanding the forces that shape our educational and professional journeys. I create these analyses because I believe that understanding these hidden dynamics is the first step toward genuine independence. If you found value in this perspective, consider subscribing to join our community of independent thinkers. Each video builds on these concepts, exploring different dimensions of how systems work and how we can navigate them more effectively. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, particularly if any specific part of this resonated with your own experience. Simply write "System Decoded" if you made it to the end and found yourself nodding along with these ideas. If this conversation sparked something in you, leaving a like helps others discover this perspective who might be feeling that same disconnect between institutional promises and their lived reality. There's a video right here that takes these concepts even further, exploring how to build genuine value outside established systems. Click and continue with me there as we move beyond understanding the problem to implementing practical solutions. The path of independence isn't easy, but it's infinitely worthwhile, and you're not walking it alone.